Over 450 years ago, a Spanish woman fell into a mystical ecstasy and saw something that would mark her forever, a vision so terrifying, so real, that upon awakening she trembled uncontrollably. Saint Teresa of Ávila had touched hell, not through pious imagination or theological speculation, but through a genuine mystical experience that left her with no doubt: hell is real. But here's what no one tells you, and what will completely change your understanding. The hell Teresa saw was not just a place of divine punishment. It was a mirror of the human soul in its hardest, most isolated form, most closed to the love of God. This revelation is disturbing because it touches exactly where we live. If you feel anxiety that won't go away, racing thoughts that steal your nights, constant worry, fear of being lost, you are living unknowingly in a hell very similar to what Teresa saw. Not a place of external fire, but an internal state of disconnection, of fragmentation, of refusal of the peace of God that should be your refuge. Teresa's vision is not a distant warning about the afterlife. It is an urgent diagnosis of the here and now of your soul. But here comes the promise that will change everything. If Teresa's vision revealed how we descend into hell, her teachings on the interior castle reveal exactly how we ascend back. Each mansion she describes is a step toward liberation. Each practice of contemplative prayer is a rescue. Each moment of genuine inner silence is a return home, and the best part? You don't need to wait a lifetime or a terrifying vision to begin. You can begin today, now, this instant, when you recognize that your soul is crying out for peace in the following teachings. We will descend together into those dark chambers that Teresa saw not to frighten us, but to liberate ourselves. We will explore why some souls fall into spiritual isolation, how unprocessed wounds create inner hells, and most importantly, how God's compassion and genuine prayer open the way to ascension. Because Teresa wants you to know you are seeing the vision of hell. Now through these teachings, precisely so that you very really need to touch it. The question your soul is asking right now is, am I living in a spiritual hell without knowing it? And how do I get out of it? If this question resonates deeply with you, if you feel this urgent calling, then you are exactly where you need to be. Comment below. What is the greatest distance you feel between your life and the peace of God? Your honest answer could be the first step towards your liberation. The fire within, how Teresa's vision of hell reveals the soul's hidden attachments. Saint Teresa saw not only flames and suffering in that breathtaking vision, she saw the naked truth of a soul that refuses to transform. The hell she witnessed was a mirror. Each dark room revealed unresolved attachment, buried fear, desire not converted into love of God. In the first mansions of the interior castle, the soul still lives scattered, fragmented among 1,000 small inner darknesses. Teresa teaches us that before any transformation, we need to see what binds us. How many of us live in our own silent hell, not through God's fault, but through a refusal to know ourselves? The attachments we carry to approval, to control, to the illusion of security are the chains Teresa saw. Her vision was not punishment. It was a cry of divine love saying, see what you are choosing out of ignorance. Contemplation now invites us to descend in mental prayer to those forgotten places within ourselves, with courage and protection. If you feel a deep restlessness, a nameless sadness, an emptiness that no distraction can fill, perhaps it's time to stop and ask yourself, What am I refusing to look at in myself? What invisible attachment is keeping me away from the peace of God? This is the first step towards ascending into the mansions. Teresa's vision does not frighten. In order to condemn, it shines a light, so that you may recognize yourself and be freed. Hell as psychological reality. Teresa's mystical warning about ignored wounds. Saint Teresa did not separate the spiritual from the emotional. She knew that unacknowledged wounds create chambers of darkness within the soul. In her terrifying vision, she witnessed not only divine punishment, but the absolute solitude of a conscience that refused to heal itself. Each ignored wound, each silenced guilt, each sorrow buried in false prayer builds the walls of an inner hell. Teresian contemplation invites us to descend courageously into that well, not to punish ourselves, but to find God's compassion right there in the darkest places. How many sleepless nights, how many racing worries, how many diffuse anxieties do we experience because we refuse to look at the genuine wound? Teresa teaches that true inner silence is not escape, it is a courageous descent. When we enter into deep prayer, mental, contemplative, we bring to the surface exactly what makes us suffer in secret. Teresa's infernal vision was a warning. You are slowly dying from wounds that you could transform. God doesn't create this hell, we create it through denial and emotional dissociation. So, the question that echoes today is, what emotional or spiritual wound am I refusing to face? Prayer before bed, morning silence, deep contemplation, these are the practices that allow us to descend to that truth without fear. Because when we descend, with God, He is there under His wings, waiting to heal us. The hell you fear is already losing power the moment you name Him in honest prayer. Why some souls resist God. Teresa's vision of the self-excluded from love. Teresa's vision revealed a heartbreaking truth. Hell is not a prison that God builds, but a refuge that the soul chooses. The condemned she saw were not there for lack of divine love, they were there because they repeatedly refused that love that knocked at the door. Saint Teresa understood from the profound teachings of the way of perfection that fear and pride create invisible bars. The soul that feels too unworthy, or that believes it deserves to suffer, or that is so full of itself that it cannot fit within God, that soul builds its own walls. And within them it remains, alone and terrified. How many of us live exactly like this? Too afraid to trust, too proud to refuse help, with an inner voice so critical that it excludes us from the divine intimacy we so long for. Teresa saw this with crystal clarity. Separation is not punished by God, sheathed suffering of the soul. Emotional and spiritual isolation is hell itself. In the mansions, she describes how the soul ascends only when it renounces that fragile and defensive self that makes it a prisoner. Spiritual discipline is not punishment, it is liberation from the chains you yourself have placed upon yourself. So today, in the quiet of genuine prayer, ask yourself, what am I too afraid of to trust God? What pride keeps me excluded? Because divine protection, refuge in the shelter of the Most, awaiting only your surrender. When you finally let your guard down, when you stop judging yourself, you discover that God was already there, under your wings, waiting, from inner darkness to light. A neuroscientific reading of Teresa's vision when Saint Teresa fell into a mystical trance and saw that abyss of suffering. Her body entered a state of absolute terror and her soul touched a truth that modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand. Profonde fear, existential anguish, the feeling of being hopelessly lost, these states reorganize our nervous system, create patterns of accelerated thought, sleepless nights, chronic worry. Teresa didn't know this in scientific terms, but she knew it in mystical experience. Hell is when the soul and body become totally disconnected, in maximum isolation. Her vision was an urgent call for us to return to that place of calm, of presence, of being rooted in God. What is remarkable is that after the terrifying vision, Teresa found God's peace, and this peace did not come from denying fear, but from transforming it through deep prayer and surrender, silent contemplation, mental slowing, resting in trust in God. These practices literally calm the nervous system, bringing neurological and emotional security. When you enter into genuine prayer, especially before sleeping or at dawn, you are doing exactly that, reorganizing your inner self, bringing strength in faith to the place where fear dwelt. Teresa shows us that light is not generated by denying darkness, but by remaining conscious in divine protection. So the practical question is, how am I taking care of my nervous system through prayer? Evening prayer is not just devotion, it's an act of emotional and spiritual health. When you surrender to stillness, when you invite God to protect your racing thoughts, when you seek comfort in the darkness, you are literally rewiring your inner self. Psalm 91, under his wings. And Psalm 23, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, are not just words, they are keys that open the door to a deep, real spiritual security that you can feel right now. The rooms beneath the castle. Is there a hell inside the soul? Saint Teresa constructed the metaphor of the interior castle with 7 mansions each, representing a deeper degree of intimacy with God. But what she never explicitly said, yet implied in her infernal vision, is that below in that castle there is an abyss, a place where the soul can descend if it refuses to ascend. In the first mansions, many of us still live very close to that abyss, scattered in distractions. World Legends, Constant Fear, thoughts. It is as if there were an underground chamber of unprocessed pain, of buried guilt, of silenced traumas that no one dared to name in prayer. Teresa saw this clearly, that hell was the mirror of what the soul refuses to transform. The great lesson is that you don't fall into hell suddenly, you descend slowly, step by step, through refusal. Refusal to examine yourself, refusal to confess, refusal to pray honestly, refusal to let God touch you where it hurts most. In the castle mansions, ascent only happens when you descend, first with courage in those forgotten chambers, those closed rooms of fear and shame. That is why deep mental prayer is so essential. It is the light that illuminates those dark spaces. Without judgment, only with the compassion of God. Teresa wanted you to know, you can go downstairs, but you don't have to stay there. So, I invite you now to a practice. In the quiet of prayer, honestly ask yourself, what part of myself am I leaving in the darkness? What wound, what shame, what fear have I never brought to light? Because when you name that thing in the presence of God, when you bravely descend into that abyss will discover that the light is already there waiting. The refuge in the shelter of the Most High is not just a safe place at the top, it is a presence that descends with you to the deepest places, bringing comfort and hope in the darkness. Teresa and the inner cry of the damned. What her vision teaches about emotional disconnection. What tormented Saint Teresa most in her vision was the silence, not the silence of contemplation, but the silence of absolute solitude. The souls she saw were so disconnected from God, so closed in on themselves, so incapable of receiving love that they could no longer even manage to do so. Scream, they cried out for help. It was as if they had lost the ability to feel alive. Teresa understood that true hell is not just physical suffering, it is the total hardening of the heart. The living death of the soul that refused to feel, refused to love, refused to allow God to touch it. This emotional and spiritual disconnection is perhaps the most subtle and dangerous form of self-destruction that exists. How many of us live in a similar state, even without knowing it? People who sleep through the night without genuine prayer, who spend entire days without a moment of inner peace, who are so busy, so rushed, so emotionally asleep that they can't even recognize their own pain. It's like being in a silent hell. You are present in body, but absent in soul. The work that Teresa left us through the path of perfection is exactly that, to reconnect, to feel again, to allow God to touch you where you are hardened, where you have built walls of protection that have become prisons. So, ask this question in honest prayer. Where am I emotionally disconnected? What part of me have I let fall asleep to avoid suffering? Because strength in faith doesn't come from never feeling pain, it comes from feeling in the presence of God, bringing your wounded heart, your anxiety, your fear, your tremendous weariness to Him. Prayer before bed can be exactly that, a moment where you allow yourself to be vulnerable again, where you reconnect with your own soul and with the loving presence of the Almighty. In this moment of reconnection, you emerge from silent death and begin to live again. Spiritual trauma and divine rescue. Teresa's vision as a turning point of the soul saint. Teresa was not a weak woman, she was a mystic of extraordinary strength. But when she received that terrifying vision of hell, she experienced something we might call a spiritual collapse, a moment of total crumbling of illusion. Everything she believed she was building, her prayer life, her pursuit of perfection, was radically questioned. And it is precisely at this breaking point that God acts with the greatest power. The vision was not punishment, it was redemption. It was as if the Almighty were saying, "You're sleeping. Wake up." In her life stories, Teresa describes how that terrible moment marked a point of no return. After the vision, she was never the same again. Her surrender became total. What is important to understand is that these moments of spiritual death, when everything crumbles, when fear takes over, when you touch the void, are not signs of divine abandonment. They are, paradoxically, signs that God loves you too much to let you continue sleeping. Divine protection sometimes comes through confronting what you fear most. In the interior castle, Teresa explains that it is precisely in these moments of inner desert, of nights without spiritual sleep, that the soul finally renounces that small and defensive self, and in this surrender something new is born, a strength not based on self-will, but on absolute trust in God. So, if you are experiencing such a moment, a period of deep anguish, of persistent anxiety, of feeling lost, perhaps it's not by chance. Perhaps it's a calling. Ask yourself, what is God trying to awaken me from? What illusion must I die to in order to be reborn? Prayers for strength, prayers for protection, prayers against fear, these are not requests to avoid pain, but to get through it with God is by your side, and discover on the other side a hope in the darkness that you had never experienced, because every genuine spiritual death contains within itself the seed of resurrection. What prevents union with God? Teresa's terrifying vision as a diagnostic of the soul. Saint Teresa was a master of spiritual diagnosis. She knew exactly what illnesses prevented the soul from ascending to the mansions. Her vision of hell functioned like a clinical mirror. Each image revealed a specific symptom of the ailing soul. inner duplicity being one thing in prayer and another in daily life, spiritual laziness that temptation of I'll really start later, hidden pride, believing you've progressed further than you actually have, emotional self-deception, deceiving yourself about your own motivations. All of this creates a chasm between you and God, not because God withdraws, but because you remain incapable of true intimacy while these defense mechanisms are active. Teresa's Book of Life, an interior castle, function precisely like this, as diagnostic tools. She asks, are you truly praying or just thinking about prayer? Have you truly renounced your attachments or are you just pretending? Do you honestly confess your racing thoughts, your worry, your fear, or do you hide them even from yourself? It's a relentless and loving assessment. The infernal vision she received was a cry, see the truth about yourself, not through judgment, but through radical honesty, because only when you truly see who you are, with all your fragmentation, duplicity, and illusion, does transformation become possible. So, I invite you to an exercise in self-awareness through deep prayer. Where am I being dishonest with myself? In what areas am I living a divided life? This is not a question to punish yourself with, but to liberate yourself from, because the peace of God, the spiritual security that Teresa so emphasizes, only arrives when you stop fighting against yourself and allow God to see you completely. In that moment of total transparency before the Almighty, perhaps in a genuine evening prayer, perhaps in a moment of radical inner silence, healing begins, and you leave that place of fragmentation to begin the true path of ascension in the mansions, the hell of distraction. Why Teresa, said the unexamined soul, is in danger. Saint Teresa had an obsession that may seem strange to the modern reader. She constantly spoke about distraction as a real spiritual threat. In the way of perfection she repeatedly returns to this theme: the soul that lives scattered, that never rests in itself, that jumps from one thought to another like a frightened bird, is in genuine danger, because chronic distraction is the gateway to everything that separates it from God, racing thoughts, endless worry, diffuse anxiety, lack of recollection, contemplative rest. Teresa knew that you can be surrounded by people, busy with activities, praying mechanically, and still be completely alone in a form of invisible hell. A scattered mind is a soul that has lost itself. Teresa's great warning is that this distraction is not merely an inconvenience, it is a sign of profound spiritual disorder. When you can't be still for even 10 minutes, when your racing thoughts consume you even in evening prayer, when you never touch genuine inner silence, something is fundamentally disconnected. It's like living in constant flight from yourself. The infernal vision she received included exactly that: souls who were so good at distracting themselves, at escaping, at not feeling, that they ended up completely losing the ability to be present. Hell, for these souls, is precisely the impossibility of distraction, being alone with themselves, without escape. So ask yourself this urgent question in prayer: how have I been living in distraction? How much time do I truly spend present with myself and with God? Because salvation begins with recollection, that capacity for contemplative rest, for genuine silence, for truly being present. The prayer before sleep can be precisely that moment when you finally stop, when you allow the noise to subside, when you invite God to meet you in the stillness. In that rest, you rediscover yourself, and you will discover that the peace of God that seemed impossible was there all along, just waiting for you to become still enough to feel it. Saved from the edge, how Teresa's vision of hell marked her final surrender. The vision of hell that Saint Teresa received was the point of no return in her spiritual life. Till that moment, she had lived for decades in a state she herself describes as lukewarm, praying, following the Carmelite rule, but with a heart that still clung to worldly things. That still sought approval. That had not yet surrendered at all, but when she touched that abyss of suffering in the vision. When she witnessed the naked truth of the soul separated from God, something broke permanently within her. It wasn't a breaking of condemnation, but of illusion. She saw that there was no middle ground, either you ascend or you descend. And in that instant, she chose to ascend completely. The vision didn't destroy her, it liberated her. Because in truth, it was that cry of divine love that saved her from a much more silent, living death. What is revolutionary in Teresa's teaching is that she understood God was not terrifying her to punish her, but to redeem her. Divine protection sometimes comes through the fright that awakens us. She had been asleep in spiritual comfort, and God, in His absolute mercy, allowed her to touch the void so that she could never ignore it again. After this vision, each of Teresa's prayers was different. Each night prayer was a true rest in the arms of God. Each moment of inner silence was a bath of genuine consolation. Because she had already known the other side and had completely rejected it, her surrender was no longer a theoretical choice. It was an existential, visceral choice, which reaffirmed itself with every breath. And now, the question that echoes for you is, will you have to touch the abyss to finally surrender completely? Or can you learn the lesson without paying that price? Strength in faith, true trust in God, doesn't come from everything being all right. It comes from being willing to renounce everything to gain the only thing that matters. If you are feeling that urgency now, that feeling that something needs to radically change in your heart, that is the voice of God calling you to that same threshold where Teresa was called. And the good news is, you don't have to be alone there. God is with you under His wings, waiting for your surrender so that you can finally live. You've come this far, and that's no accident. Saint Teresa of Ávila, through her terrifying vision and profound teachings about the mansions, has been speaking to you across the centuries. She wants you to know a truth that can transform your life. The hell you fear, the emptiness you feel, the anxiety that haunts you, the racing thoughts that steal your sleep, all of this has a name, a cause, and a cure. You are not alone in this struggle. Millions of souls before you have touched that abyss and returned. And you can do the same. The first step is simple, but revolutionary. Start praying for real, not mechanical prayer. Not empty words, but a genuine encounter with God in inner silence. Set aside 10 minutes, just 10 each night before bed. Sit quietly. Bring your wounded heart, your worry, your fear, your hope. Tell God exactly what you feel. Listen. Rest in the arms of the Most High, under His wings, in the refuge of the Most High's shelter. This is the prayer before bed that Teresa so emphasized, and it is here that true transformation begins. Because when you allow yourself to be vulnerable before God, when you bring your truth into the light, you emerge from silent death and begin to live again. Ask yourself these questions that will change your life. What emotional or spiritual wound am I refusing to face? Where am I living a double life, one thing in prayer and another in daily life? What part of myself have I left in darkness? Am I truly trusting in God or just pretending to be okay? These questions are not meant to punish you, they are meant to set you free. Because only when you see the truth about yourself can healing begin, and when you surrender completely to God. when you stop fighting against yourself and allow Him to find you in the deepest dwellings of your soul. You discover something that words can hardly express, a peace that surpasses all understanding, a spiritual security that does not depend on external circumstances, a hope in the darkness that never fades. Now is the time to act. Don't let this teaching remain just pretty words. The life of Saint Teresa shows us that spiritual transformation is real, it is possible, and it is for you if this video touched your heart. If you felt God's urgent call speaking through these truths, then subscribe to this channel, because here, week after week, you will find teachings that will nourish your soul, practices that will transform your prayer, and the company of an entire community of people who, like you, are ascending the mansions of the inner castle. Leave your comment below telling us which of these truths about Teresa touched your heart the most. And what is the first step you will take today on your journey of spiritual liberation? Your response could inspire someone who is as lost as you once were. And always remember, God conquered death, conquered fear, conquered hell. And when you are in His divine protection, when you rest in His compassion, when you allow Him to save you to conquer, may the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, guard your heart and mind in Christ Jesus. You are not alone. You never have been.